So if I can start by means of introduction. My name is Corinne Mully. I'm a Professor Emerita at ITLS in Sydney. And it's my great pleasure to introduce this Thredbo webinar, which is a summary of the workshops 2A and 2B from Thredbo last year and acts as a prelude to Thredbo in South Africa next year. We're going to have two sets of speakers. First of all, workshop 2A and then workshop 2B. This is the first webinar of 3, and the recording will be available at the end of the workshop when Becky receives it and uploads it onto the website. Can I start by thanking you very much for attending? We've got 65 registrations from every continent in the world, and I hope that you find it interesting. So our first presenters are Gunnar and Andre. Can I first give you a short resume of Gunnar Alexandersson? He is from the Stockholm School of Economics. He's a senior researcher in transport economics at the school and holds a part-time position as a senior advisor on regulations and international affairs at the Swedish railway operator. He chaired the local organising committee for Thredbo 15 when it was held in Stockholm, and as a member of the international steering committee of the Thredbo conference series. His partner in this presentation is Andrei Dmitriev, who is a director of teaching excellence at the HSE University in Moscow. He's worked as a researcher in optimal organizational structures in the railway and bus sectors, including different types of partnerships and hybrid forms of governance. He has also developed more than 20 years of experience in the economic analysis of the transport sector, including an assessment of structural railway reform measures in Russia and the regulatory impact assessment in the bus sector. He's consulted on a number of European Commission projects regarding the analysis of financial models for public-private partnerships in transport. Their slides are going to be shared centrally, so you'll hear them go next slide after each one. Gunnar is going to start, followed by Andre, with the conclusion by Gunnar at the end. So can I hand it over to you, Gunnar and Becky, to start showing the slides?
Yes, thank you, Corinne. Thank you for that introduction. So I hope you can all see the slides now. And so this workshop 2A had the main headline: Public Transport, Governance via Contracting, Collaboration, and Hybrid Organizational Arrangement. Next slide, please. And the focus for this workshop was to look at the interaction between authorities, operators, and other actors involved in public transport. And as we said early on, with a special reference to how long-established contracting practices are surviving. This has been a long-standing theme of Thredbo for a long time, and this was revisited once again at this conference. So we also wanted to provide what we could call a theoretical rationale for the scope of contractual flexibility. And at this conference, we very much discussed then the technical transitions to zero-emission vehicles and also external shocks like COVID-19. This was a very important setting for the discussions during the conference. We had a number of papers presented at the conference. They could be divided into these main headlines: the contracting modalities in Sweden, with a couple of papers on that, the green transition, going to introduction of zero-emission vehicles, and also hybrid organizational arrangements. So next slide, please. And I will focus here in this presentation on the main outcomes following the discussions, and also the paper we co-wrote, Andre and I, after the conference. And we have sorted these under these headlines: the contractual arrangements in times of transition and uncertainty, where we discussed and found that there is a tendency in recent years that authorities want to have more control over operators and assets. And that's more or less regardless of whether the operators want that or not. We can see that happening, for example, due to electrification. Moreover, particularly if we look at the experience from COVID-19, we see a tendency go more into gross cost contracts rather than passenger incentive contracts. We also discussed and found that in order to handle and allocate risks in the transition to zero-emission vehicles, and zero-emission buses in particular in this case, the operators may form supply chain partnerships. But we also found that the risks and power imbalances related to electricity provision was probably only possible to handle by authorities. We discussed a lot, and you will hear more about this later, the need for flexible and less rigid contracts that would allow for development and negotiations. In some countries, though, it's clear that the legal framework to do this may be a hindrance when you have procurement procedures, for example. Nevertheless, we found that best practice could be to combine very transparent contract enforcement procedures that are clear to everyone early on in a form of control with the predetermined rules for welfare improvement amendments in collaboration. We discussed a lot the pros and cons and viability of competitive tendering, and we found that it's still a tool to achieve certain goals in these institutional and mature markets. But as I think have been said also before, it should not be an ideology, but serve as a credible threat and benchmark for market participants to keep up performance. Next slide, please. Another headline we had discussed was the understanding of different organizational forms and intermediaries. We had a couple of papers on this in the workshop at the conference, and we found it's important to get a better understanding of particularly these hybrid organizational arrangements. And they could be, for example, intermediaries between vertical integration and separation in the railway sector, and having both public and private bus operators working at the same time, for example, in the city. So I will leave now to my rapporteur, Andre, to continue with the outcomes, and also then a framework which we developed as a part of this workshop.
Thank you, Gunnar. So the participants of workshop reached a consensus that in public transport, continuity of relations between the parties is a source of value. So that's why adaptation to unpredicted disturbances plays the central role in determining the efficiency of such interactions. So in order to provide a theoretical rationale for the different forms of mutually beneficial interactions between public transport authorities and operators, we reached a common understanding of the terms collaboration and coordination to ensure that the famous strategic tactical operational approach can be further developed to account for uncertainty and suggest flexible governance solutions. So to be clear about the term, coordination is meant to be attitudes, behaviors, and outcomes of joint determination of common goals. So it may be shaped by meta-governance and or institutional, regulatory, structural, or technological streamlines, but essential is that both parties, or all parties, have common goals. This is different from collaboration, which also a voluntary commitment to work together. But instead of having same goals, it implies shared outcomes, although not necessarily wholly shared objectives. So, but in this case, for sure, an opportunistic behavior is totally excluded. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a collaboration by definition. Next slide, please. So this is the tentative framework which enriches the strategic, tactical, operational way of thinking about the public transport sector to account for the uncertainty which are included in the right-hand column. So in the first column, we have a description of legally binding solutions or contracts which take into account risks deemed to be calculated on the basis of probabilities and thus contracted. So at the strategic level, commitments from the high levels of governance take the form of budget limits and government guarantees, as well as explicit indications of the future technology shifts, and in case of monetary policy, well forecasted future interest rate policy, which shapes the cost of capital and thus allows to plan better further developments of the sector. At the tactical level, the existing contractual environment can be extended to in the form of hybrid organizational arrangements. For instance, if we have a vertical integration, it may endogenize some problems which arise in case of major technological shifts. And here the supply chain partnership contracts may be a solution. In case of different incentives, which definitely public operators and private operators may have, the central government or the central planner can benefit from a mixture of different forms of ownership in the same market and introduce a horizontal mixed delivery models to benefit from this heterogeneity in incentives. So parties then learn from each other, which which incentives work better in different circumstances, and thus learn from different operators, different forms of ownership, and thus elaborate a more detailed regulatory contract. And in case of pre-contractual and as well as post-contractual flexibility, some discussion of bus age as a quality requirement, as well as asset ownership transfer afterwards the contractual expiration of contractual period, may serve an important solution, providing a hybrid arrangement between the public transport authority and operator. And at the operational stage, contract fulfillment, as Gunnar mentioned already, may be in the center of contractual relations when gross cost contracts play a predominant role in case of major changes previously unpredicted by the parties. But it's important to ensure that contracts, that within the contract, incentives are properly rewarded and innovations are well paid. This works, used to work pretty well in case of accounting for the risks and the calculated probability. But when we have unforeseeable major changes, uncertainties take place, and there is a need for flexible government solutions. Again, at the strategic level, at the goals deliberation level, I would say, the parties should use some anchors which may take the form of meta-governance. For instance, the government may announce some preferences and play a coordinating role, for instance, initiating a green agenda transition. Thus, even without explicit mentioning in the contract, parties would better understand the very direction of future changes, and it will play an indirect coordinating role for their further interactions. At the tactical level, collaboration takes place, and it is important to set ex ante the rules to change the rules to ensure trustworthiness between them. So, but this trustworthiness is only based on the mutual understanding that both parties are competent enough to make decisions, and they engage in pre-contractual negotiation of the baseline agreement, taking into account that in the future there might be a situation that they have to sit at the table and discuss possible amendments of the contract. So these discussions may be initiated by the public transport operator or by the private operator. So the workshop participants framed this as an incidence that at the tactical level, public transport authorities play a major role and initiate such a renegotiation of existing contracts, which we call collaboration. And finally, at operational level, contract amendments may take place, and it definitely requires closer cooperation. And thus, for instance, some unexpected losses may trigger the situation, and operator may initiate the renegotiation of the contract. But it's important to mention that in principle, all the contracts are incomplete, and the parties should understand this from the very beginning. So it's too costly to draft a perfectly complete contract. That's why some flexibilities have to be included in the future cooperating and collaborating engagements of the two parties. Next slide, please. So we indeed developed further the strategic tactical operational framework, and at the strategic level highlight the role of commitments explicitly stated by the higher government levels. At the tactical level, we introduced as a solution hybrid organizational arrangements that help internalize risk allocation between the parties. And at the operational level, we emphasize the role of rewarding schemes that deem to ensure incentives to innovate and work and have better rewards in monetary forms on risky investments and innovations. And the next slide will discuss the uncertainty. And then it is harder to include all the unforeseeable, actually next to impossible to include unforeseeable contingencies in the contract. That's why at the strategic level, coordination takes place, resulting in mutually shared social values. At the tactical level, collaboration occurs in the form of trusting relations between the public transport authority and operators. And the operational level, cooperation helps the parties better understand the nature of unforeseen circumstances. So next slide is Gunnar's.
Yes, thank you, Andre. To conclude, I will also tell you a little bit more about the research recommendations. So we think that further research, and also this is something that could be discussed further at later conferences, we see that there is a need to provide some insights from the dynamic contracting theory in order to capture the facts, the stylized facts of the bus and rail industry. So looking at the permanent versus the temporary shocks, the real information, see the better collaboration, benchmarking, etc. And we also see that there's a need to explore what we call the barriers to good collaboration. We touched upon this a bit during the workshop, but this is something that needs to be looked at further. It's clear, as already mentioned, that there is a need for commitment and competence, for example, between various parties. This can sometimes break down when, for example, individuals leave a company or organization. So that could be one barrier to continued good collaboration, for example. We also think there's a need for having more analysis and comparisons of strategies and practices that are used by different public transport authorities. For example, when we look closer at the further electrification of buses and electric requirements. And we see a need for more quantitative analysis of the railway systems, comparing them at the sort of inter-organizational studies, where we also can include coordination performance variables. So these are some research recommendations. And to conclude, I just also want to thank you for listening, and also thank again all the workshop participants which helped us in this work. And we hope that this framework that was developed as an outcome from this workshop can be useful in further research and also in further discussions at later Thredbo conferences. Thank you.
Corinne, you're on. Yes.
Yes. Thank you, Gunnar and Andre, for summarising what happened in workshop 2A. Can I ask all participants who want to ask a question to type this into the chat, and we can read them out so that the speakers can answer the questions? I think I'm right, Becky, that there are no questions so far, so maybe I can start with my own question. And I think this is addressed to both Gunnar and Andre. I don't know what your views are, but how do you see the future? In particular, which do you think of the risks that you discussed is the greatest risks to effective contracting in the future?
That's a good question. I think that we've seen that I mean, COVID-19 was obviously an external shock that we did not foresee. But maybe if you're speaking particular on risks rather than uncertainties, but okay, we can see the risk that there would be another event similar to COVID-19 that could affect the whole industry. That is a risk in itself. But if we talk about the risk that we can more calculate and even put in the contract, maybe you, Andre, have some ideas
Yes,
on that.
I would like. It's indeed a very interesting and hard question to answer, and I would piggyback on your first idea that once an event takes place, so we can shift it from the right hand column where uncertainty is discussed to the left hand where risks are mentioned, because there is like probability of greater than 0 now. So we learn from that past experience, and here is the on the one hand, the scope of uncertainty shrinks because we learned from past experience. On the other hand, it is still too costly to write a complete contract. So I would say that both public transport authorities and operators would now become smarter to include in the force majeure clauses some things which they had never included so far. So it would make the contracts maybe costlier, but at the same time account for greater uncertainty in this case. So contracts will become more detailed, I believe.
So as a follow-up question to that, to what extent do you think ownership drives the change to the contract? Because clearly COVID-19 was a big shock to the system. Do you think public operators have learned more than private operators, or vice versa?
So ultimately, what can I start, Gunnar?
Yes, please.
So ultimately, the taxpayer pays the bill. So in this case, it is absolutely essential to discuss the mutual understanding of the very priorities of development of the society, and public transport serves the like subordinate role. So it does not shape the society. It like serves as a means, not the final end. So in this case, if the society clearly prefers health versus mobility, then it can be contracted. The problem was that these questions were not, at least in my country, discussed explicitly before it took place. But since we have more like public transport, public ownership in this case, so in most cases, these problems were endogenized. So it means that since the public authority takes charge, they are finally responsible for that. So, and we, the workshop participants also noted that other things equal, there is more influence of public ownership right now after COVID than before. So it may, answering your question, it shifted a little bit towards greater involvement of public sector and public ownership than it used to be.
I could add maybe that I think there are similar lessons for public and private operators, but what we could see, for example, in Sweden, that where few cases where we had the public authority also having an in-house bus operator under direct ownership and control, it was easier for them to absorb this shock because it didn't really affect any contract. There were no real contracts between the authority and the operating bus operator in that case. But that made it easier to handle this particular shock.
Thank you both. We've had one question that come into the chat from Kimmo Sinizalo. The question is, Is the shift towards gross cost contracts a natural result from the realization that demand shocks and shifts cannot be reliably managed with operator capabilities? Gunnar, would you like to go first?
Yeah, I can think that in the short run, it is a natural result, because we see that many of the contracts that were renegotiated were actually transformed from passenger incentive contracts into gross cost contracts to handle the situation that arose, that the passengers were not there. The compensation to the operator could not be handled by means of counting the number of passengers. But I think it is a bit more difficult to see what will happen in the long run. I could assume that we can see that in some cases you could start out having the contract as a gross cost contract, and then over time adding perhaps other types of incentives at certain points in time, and also, as we already discussed, also to include more of safety nets and specific, say, points where you will go into negotiations if things like that happen again. Maybe you want to add something, Andre?
Yes, it's again a very good question. I would only like to add that whether it's natural or not natural result. In 2016, when Moscow public transport authorities decided whether to introduce net cost or gross cost contract, they designed the market, the bus market, in such a way that they tried to do both. So the public transport operator operated on the basis of gross cost contract, as well as private operators introduced to the market were also operating gross contract, but in case of ownership, they differed, and they of course had different incentives in this case. So what the public transport authorities did, they learned from the very difference in these incentives observed from the operational performance of the private operators, and then use this newly acquired knowledge, including difference in incentives, when drafting the second the second round competitive tendering procedures. So the immanent difference between gross and net cost contract, which is the difference between in incentives, can also be observed by clashing to some extent the two operators in the same market, which have different forms of ownership, public, and private operators. And this is why I do not think that this is a natural result. There are other ways how to stimulate the incentives incentives of operators, not only by introducing net cost contracts.
Timo, are you happy with the response? Do you want to type into chat anything that you want to follow up with? We had a little bit of a different response from Gunnar and Andre. Do you want to add something?
May I speak?
Of course.
Okay. So
briefly,
really,
though, please.
Yes. What I was implying was that even though we now have seen one crisis that was unpredictable, and we could add planning for such a crisis into the contracts, is it in any way realistic to assume that transport operators could predict the probability and impact and price it in? And in my opinion, it is not, and it's not even desirable that transport operators would try to bear that risk, because they really don't have the capabilities for predicting, managing, or mitigating that level of risk. And of course, knowing what happened last time does not really help us know what will happen next time.
Thank you. Gunnar?
I think what we suggest is that the true uncertainties, they are not really possible to put into to treat as things in the contract in the way that we are usually doing it with risks that we can calculate and discuss the probability for happening. And that's why we also suggest that these kind of uncertainties need to be handled in different ways, in other ways, as explained by Andrew, by means of looking at the strategic, tactical, operational level in the framework we suggest.
Andre, do you want to add anything?
Yes, I totally agree. So otherwise, it would make a contract too expensive to draft and to implement. So that's why if ex ante the authorities and operators understand that the collaboration is not just possible but a natural solution for problems that may not be forecasted in advance, then that would it would help them both make contractual relations easier, more transparent, and less expensive. So trustworthiness, competence, and mutual understanding of the common goals would work as a, if you want, coordinating role, and would help them benefit from the collaborative activities.
Sorry. I think at that point, we really need to move on to the next presentations in order to complete our workshop on time. Can I thank Gunnar and Andre for not only a very interesting presentation, but also for the interesting discussion that followed. And Kimmo comments that we are all in agreement, which is a very good note on which to end this particular element of the workshop. So moving now to workshop 2B, our two speakers are Brendan Finn and Barbara Yen. Can I start by giving you very brief outlines of their experience? Brendan is an independent transport consultant who's based in Dublin in Ireland. He began his career with Dublin's public bus company and has worked on a wide variety of consulting activities in organisation and operation of public transport in Europe, Africa and Asia. His main focus is on bus-based transport, covering institutional frameworks for urban passenger transport, passenger bus service contracting, operations management and support systems to improve public transport, including BRT, ITS and demand responsive transport. In developing countries, he has a particular interest in the practical means to improve informal transport, which is often the primary mode of transport for the people. Barbara comes from a different continent. She's an associate professor in the Department of Transportation and Logistics Management at the National Yingming Chiao Tung University in Taiwan. Barbara is a transport economist, specializing in behavior analysis, public transport, value capture, travel demand management, and performance evaluation. Barbara has undertaken a significant amount of government and industry research funded by competitive funding from government and industry. These have included studies on public transport, travel behavior management, value capture, and road safety. Can I hand over to you, Brendan, to kick off your part of the webinar?
Okay, thank you, Corinne. You can see the screen in full screen mode. You're mute, but I'll take it that that's a yes. I'll get started. Thank you. Okay, first of all, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all, wherever you are in the world. And it's my pleasure to introduce the workshop 2B, which is complementary to the workshop we've just heard from Gunnar and Andre. My name is Brendan Finn. I was chairman of the workshop, and Barbara Yen was rapporteur, and we worked together to make this happen. So, no, why is it? Okay, we are going forward. That's fine. So this is going to be done in 3 parts. I'm going to briefly give you a bit of context, then I'll talk about the papers, and then Barbara will take over and she'll introduce you to the findings and the conclusions. We dealt with things in situations of fundamental change, which was so wide-ranging that we realized that we need to put a bit of structure on it. And we realized we could talk to each other if we understood the different contexts, which were threefold: geographic, the level of establishment or maturing of contracting, and the types of service that we were talking about. In geographic terms, I think people are quite familiar that in different parts of the world, the types of public transport, the markets it serves, and indeed the form of regulation and organization is quite different. So European, South American, Chinese, African transport have their own characteristics and are somewhat different from each other for various reasons. A second contextual issue is whether we're talking about situations where there's long established mature arrangements or reasonably established ones that are stable, and that's been the traditional domain of Thredbo. But there are many other contexts where there are stable arrangements that don't have contracting, there's emerging use of contracting, but it's a bit vulnerable, or indeed there's fairly weak frameworks. And we need to realize as well that there can be different levels for different modes or types of service within the same city. And the third cluster is the type of service. We have urban modes, bus, paratransit, urban rail, each of which is a very different domain and its own different markets and relationships. We have the interurban sector, mainline and regional rail, intercity bus. We have innovative services like DRT and emerging ones like micromobility. So the service context is quite relevant. So the final thing we considered was that relationship between authorities and operators is likely to vary with context we've talked about there. And again, within the domain of Thredbo, we've typically talked about the emerging constructive progressive partnerships that look to go beyond the contract, or ones that have a formal relationship to deliver what was contracted. But we also see other types of relationship, a positive working relationship that seeks to improve a sector, such as in the paratransit, moving from the informal to the formal, where it is a constructive relationship. In many parts of the world, we just see a very passive relationship between operators and regulators. It's just a matter of oversight of licenses and compliance. But we also see very hostile environments, again, typically where there is paratransit, where the authorities seek to eliminate them. So it's important that we position ourselves within that spectrum when we talk about relationships. So that really led to the reason why we had 2 workshops, because we were working with very different worlds, for want of a better word. So I'd like to move on now to the papers. We had 9 papers within the workshop, and I'll give you a 1-minute overview of each. I think it's quite important because it gives you an idea then of where we're coming from with the findings and the recommendations that we have made. We had 4 that looked at the informal sector, 2 from Philippines, 1 from Africa, 1 from India. We had 3 that looked at the resource and pricing strategies, 1 from a mix of countries, Australia, Singapore, and the UK, 1 from the US, and 1 from Spain and the intercity bus market. And then 2 that looked at aspects of innovation within the system, 1 from Chile and 1 from Sweden. So if I begin with our first 2, they both come from the Philippines, both come from Metro Manila, which is a very large and complex metropolitan area, 17 contiguous cities with over 12 million people. The urban passenger transport consists of very heavy volume urban rail, 5,000 buses, 50,000 jeepneys. Buses and jeepneys are collectively known as public utility vehicles, which operate under individual vehicle franchises issued by the National Land Transport and Franchising Regulatory Body. So they're assigned a slot on a designated route. Most of the routes concentrate on an urban orbital, the EDSA, and many operators will ply on the same route. An operator may ply on many routes, so it's very fragmented. In 2017, the Public Utility Vehicle Modernization Program was launched, and that had very limited success, to be honest with you. But then along came the pandemic, and as a result, they were able to put in median busways on EDSA, To be able to use it was linked to reform. Operators needed to consolidate. They were given a route permit. This was moderately successful, but the regulator's capacity does need to be strengthened, and that was examined in the paper. The second paper from Manila looked at the jeepneys, and the service contracting program was about upgrading the jeepneys, not about phasing them out. A pre-pandemic effort to move them to service contracting had little or no success, but then again, the pandemic came along. Incomes fell drastically, governments needed to step in, and they did so by providing a mix of gross cost and net cost contracts, which was a way of channeling financial support to the sector. On some routes, operators consolidated, and others they didn't, but in either case, they were required to enter a service contract, accept monitoring technology on their vehicle, and the payouts were based on the measured performance, and it did have some success in supply and quality. Other metrics weren't so good. Key issues that emerged were institutional arrangements, delays in payments, and operators claiming that the technology had problems. The third paper looked in Africa and a wide range of countries there from a project called Transitions. And in Africa, many of you may be familiar, the informal public transport is the main form of public transport in the cities. Minibuses, midibuses, taxis, and the motorbike taxis are now growing really rapidly, typified by very large numbers of individually owned vehicles, daily rental to drivers, everything's on tight margin, low wage, low quality, poor safety. But it's important to note that the degree of informality varies. Many have permits for what they do. They're not illegal. Much of the informality is in the service type or the organization. So government often steps in to try to bring about reform, but the other end of the spectrum is simply to ban them and eliminate them. And the paper looked at a wide spectrum in this. The reforms, where they were intended to be positive, looked at fleet renewal and service quality, but also consolidation to see if they could corporatize them into more like company-type entities. The experience and outcomes have been rather varied. They follow different paths, different trends. But a key thing that comes across is that the institutional and regulatory framework and its capacity proves to be very important to success or lack of success. And another finding was that the classic regulatory cycle model, which tends to be circular, was actually, there were many different pathways or nuances that aren't captured in that, and we'll come back to that point, or Barbara will. The fourth one looked at the case of Kochi in India, about 2 million people, over 1,000 private buses, which had been the dominant form of transport. In 2017, the Kochi Metro opened, taking half of its riders from the existing bus services, which needless to say undermined their revenue base. That led to a restructuring of the bus system. There was also a transport authority and transport fund established at the time of the metro. And following a consultation process, about 1,000 of the private buses aggregated into 7 companies of somewhat different formats. The operators, I think, weren't too happy about it, but they accepted it due to the heavy impact on the revenues from the metro and the pandemic. And the paper follows one of the companies called Clean Smart Buses, which aggregated almost 200 buses. It had an interesting ownership composition, 51% stake with the private operators, 26% with state-owned bodies, and the Expatriate Trust took on 20%. And they were able to enter a gross cost contract with the authority for redesigned bus routes that connected to metro stations and demand centres. And that seems to be going pretty well still. The second cluster we looked at was the resource issues. And we had an interesting paper that looked at the arguments and validity of some commonly held positions, which are that private operated buses and public transport provide more efficient services, but in the public sector, it's better working conditions and value for money. And one of the key things the paper pointed out was that whose perspective is being considered is important. The end user is interested in service coverage and quality. Government is interested in financial support and value for money. Workers are interested in pay and conditions, and operating companies are interested in profits and margins. And it drew from 3 sources: a technical meeting between organizations of employers and workers, a report that had been commissioned in Australia, and an overview of cases in Australia, UK, and Singapore, and also in Ireland. And the key message that came across is that value for money needs to be achieved in ways that are fair and equitable. So whose perspective and what lens you look through is actually very important. The second paper that dealt with this cluster looked at very much the safety issue and asks, within the contracting framework, do we see that ownership or leasing, does it have implications for safety? And they noted that we have a lot of information about how bus safety relates to external factors, what causes collisions and how you can mitigate them, but that impact of ownership has not been looked at in the bus world, although there's a fair bit of empirical evidence that in the truck, taxi, and car hire sectors, it is a factor. They looked at the US National Transport Database and did a modeling that shows that ownership does significantly impact injury rate. They found that agencies who were driving vehicles they don't own had accident rates or injury rates that was 35% higher. They also noted the size of firm was a factor. Smaller firms had higher injury rates than larger ones, and that private transit agencies had higher rates than public ones. Now, it's quite possible that the three factors are interrelated, that smaller firms or private companies that tend to hire rather than public, but nevertheless, it's certainly a key issue that's worth examining further. The third within the cluster looked at the intercity bus market in Spain, which is strictly controlled compared to a very liberal market in the rest of Europe. They have a competition for the market regime, and the design of this has been, I think that was introduced over 20 years ago for first time round, and the structure of the competition has been modified various times in recent years. So the paper talked us through the different arrangements for regional interregional routes, that there are legacy ones from with 20-year contracts when the system was first introduced. But the particular point is that the weightings in the criteria for between price and frequency, that they became much more important as various rounds went on, and that over time, substantial price differences per unit distance have arisen. In part, this is due to the tender criteria applicable at the time. In part, it's due to the context, such as whether there are other routes available, the consumer affordability. And they found that the price per kilometre decreases with route length, so longer routes have a lower price per kilometre, with market size, how big are the cities that they connect, and whether there are fast rail options. We then moved on to the third cluster, which was looking at innovation aspects. From Chile, we had an interesting paper that looked at an experiment to see how drivers behave in certain situations. What we know is that, or we believe that ridership will increase and revenues will increase if we have good quality services, on-time departure, regular headway, smooth driving, because customers value it. But in the real world, we observe that drivers can behave individually, seeking personal gain by gaming the system, which goes against what influences customers. So they wanted to see what incentives would get drivers to work as a team. They set up an experimental setting with based on different driver compensation schemes. The driver makes choice along the route. And what they found was that the team-based pay for performance gave the best results in terms of regular headways, speed, and loading profiles. But there was an increase in free riders because they weren't incentivized to control revenue protection. The final paper that we looked at was about how to implement innovation in stable competitive tendering regimes. And this came from Sweden. And they noted that there is an expectation within society that there should be an innovation, but that in the public transport sector it's not seen to be innovative, and this was viewed negatively. And they saw four logics at play: bureaucratic, market, innovation logic, and societal logic. And they asked two key questions, which were also looked at in papers that were dealt with in workshop 2A. What is innovation in the public transport sector, and who's actually looking for it? And how can it be accommodated in a very strict tender and contract regime? And they had three key findings or reflections. One is that the sector itself doesn't consider itself to be innovative. They don't see themselves that they should be innovators, but rather they evolve things over time. A second was, can you really command and specify innovation and procure it? And the third was that when you're in a penalty-oriented setting, then risk aversion can be a very inhibiting factor to innovation and risk. So they felt that it was necessary to find a balance in allowing flexibility while assuring outcomes. So that overviews the 9 papers that we dealt with. And I'd like to now pass on to Barbara to talk us through discussions and findings. Thank you.
Thank you, Brendan, and thank you for Prince's introduction. I would be introduce the third part. It actually consists of 4 portions, including initial questions, workshop contributions, research recommendation, and policy recommendation. Next slide, please. For workshop 2B, we actually come up with several questions. And first, effective pathway. Do we have any effective pathway to move informal service to a contractual or service agreement basis service? Second, suitability of competitive tendering in terms of transform the operator sector or mobility service. Third, fundamental change of governance relationship in developing country setting and for technology support innovative services. Finally, contracting impact on outcomes. Do contracting authorities have sufficient understanding and what the choices they can have? Next slide, please. Next, I will introduce our workshop contributions. We actually come up few of them. The first is requirements and the solutions that need to be context specific. Second, informal transport is the primary form of passenger transport in most developing countries. And proper understanding of this operation mechanism is critical because currently they are under research. Third, how to formalize the informal and what is the required framework and how to build the relationships is also unknown at the moment. Contracting authorities need better understanding of what they are doing and why. And we need evidence-based kind of analysis. Next slide, please. There are three more contributions that we identified from our workshop. The next one is the necessary funding is also required. Basically, that's everything. That's a fundamental. The next, transport contracts can be used as a tool to achieve broader societal goals. However, we always have to keep in mind and be careful of losing focus of the original purpose that's to provide accessibility. Finally, innovation is not just implementing technologies, but it's a bigger scope. It requires change, risk, and uncertainty. So we believe the current procurement practice and the contract structure might not be able to achieve this goal. Next slide, please. And then I come to research recommendation. We think knowledge exchange is essential, and this is not limited to our workshop. It basically should be the kind of concept for all the workshop, because we need to have this exchange mechanism to be able to understand what is going on and what is happening to better frame our questions. Second, stakeholder relationship is critical as well. Finally, social outcomes. We need to understand the impacts on various parties, such as stakeholders, societal groups, or even labors. And we also want to understand what's the value for money or even value for who. Finally, will be the equity issue. Next slide, please. This is our, oh, sorry, we have two more slides. This is also the research recommendation. We want to define the informal sector. From the paper composition of our workshop, we can know there are several papers from the independent developing country. So how to define it is a question mark. Innovation is another aspect. How to define it, what's the purpose, how to design innovation concept in the contract. Finally, data-driven and evidence-based analysis is essential. However, we need to know how to identify the data or evidence that is needed for the contracting process and decisions. Next slide, please. This is our final slide, policy recommendations. Stakeholders' involvement in designing contracts are critical, and lower the barriers of participating in competitive tendering would be very helpful, especially for the informal sectors. And how to lower it, we have come up several examples. Trust in the process, scrutinizing of outcomes. Again, evidence-based process and decisions is essential. Next, social objectives need to be balanced with the core policy objective to grow public transport usage. We should not losing our focus. Next, value for money need to achieved in ways they are fair and equitable. Last one, contracts should be facilitate innovation, not hinder it. That will be all for our workshop. Brendan, do you want to do some conclusion?
No, thank you. This, I think, is a good point in which to end it. Thank you very much for a very concise and clear presentation on the main outcomes of the workshop. So again, thanks to, and I didn't put up a listing of the names of the people who participated in the workshop, but we are merely the reporters from it. It was the participants in the workshop, as always in Thredbo, that actually make all these recommendations come together. Thank you.
Can I start by thanking Brendan and Barbara for a very precise and concise and to time presentation, because that allows us a lot of time for questions. Anyone who has a question, please type it into the chat and we can deal with it as they come up. In the meantime, I have a number of questions, and that is the advantage of leading the webinar. My first one relates to your last policy comment, and I think maybe both of you will want to respond, because risk aversion in innovation is something which certainly Brendan and I have seen before, because prior to deregulation in the UK, the institutional framework had been in place for 50 years, and it was one of the criticisms of it is that it stifled innovation. So how can we address this need to deliver innovation within a contractual framework, which in a sense posits stationarity for the duration of the contract? Brendan, do you want to go first?
Not really, but I suppose I will with a question like that. I think one of the key things is maybe if we come back to the previous one, the research. Yeah, this is always the great thing, do more research. But one of the key things we said is, look, first of all, we have to define and categorize what is innovation and what is the purpose of it, what is it meant to achieve? Because quite often people are hammered for not being innovative without it being clear what innovation is sought or what is its purpose. And I think that is actually a very important conversation that could take place in either another webinar or within the next Thredbo meeting as a theme in its own right. Just what is it we are trying to do here? And sometimes the innovation is really, it is driven by certain technologies or advocates of certain technologies who want that we should be doing it this way or that way. And Barbara's already made the point, and maybe it's back here somewhere. If we go to the key workshop contributions, it's important to retain primary focus on the core mission of delivering accessibility. And I think that is fundamental. We must never lose sight of the fact that our job, whether it be the authority who commands it or the operator who provides it, our job is to bring people where they need to go day in, day out, all the categories of people within society for whatever purpose they need to travel. So I think that loop has got to be closed in any conversation about innovation. That's not answering your question, but it's trying to give a roadmap or at least a structure in which we can start to answer the question. Because that comes back to what is it that authorities should be commanding and where they should be directing operators or their contracted operators to do X, Y, or Z, and what's the balance among them. Barbara, maybe you might like to add to that?
Thank you, Brendan, and thank you, Corinne, for the questions. For innovation, I remember I had one interesting conversation with this industry partner back in the Thredbo 17. I asked them how you can achieve innovation goals. The operator come back to me, if you want us to be innovative, put it in the contract. So I think the question should go back to the policy makers. What kind of innovation that you want and what kind of goal you want to achieve? You need to have those kind of understanding to be able to really guiding the whole train. That would be my response. I hope I answered the question.
Well, I would like to pursue it before I turn to the question that's in the chat from John Nelson. And this is really addressed to Brendan because I know he likes my questions. Can you define innovation as really doing something that's different from the status quo? And therefore, should we really think about innovation as another external shock and deal with it in the way that Gunnar and Andre were talking about in workshop 2A?
Okay, my first reaction would be, I don't think innovation is an external shock or a systemic shock. I think innovation is something that, if done correctly, is something that anybody would want to do anyway. And when a new opportunity comes along, they will try it, test it, and maybe adopt it. The external shock is when an authority or a set of politicians demand a change, a very specific change of a technology or an arrangement, without a deep consultation to the sector, without understanding how it impacts on the sector, and indeed without a practical roadmap of how to achieve it, without disturbing the fundamental principles of transporting passengers in a viable way for those within the system. So to me, it only becomes a shock when it is imposed without a deep consultation within the industry, and especially if it's imposed by people who have an agenda that is totally different to the primary agenda of transportation of people. That's my personal opinion.
Well, I think we might disagree, but we won't pursue that now because we do have a question from John Nelson from ITLS, and I'll read that out. The question is, will we still have an informal transport sector in developing countries in, say, 20 years from now, or will it all have been formalized away? And if so, will we lose more than we gain?
I think we can take it that we will still have an informal transport sector in developing countries in 50 years' time, never mind 20 years' time. There's a role for it. Let's come back to what we mean by informal. I was saying that, you know, a lot of what is informal has permits for what it does. So there's informality of, let's say, the operator, there's informality of the service type, there's informality of the organization. So a large part of what we would call formalizing the informal is just basic compliance, getting basic standards in place so that there is reasonable quality drivers, improvement in the vehicles, improvement in the safety, and that there's a certain amount of dignity for the passengers and indeed for the workers themselves, who often work in quite a brutal environment. So improving that still can have a relatively informal transport sector. The other thing we have to remember is, particularly in Africa, but also in many other parts of the world, the scale of population growth and growth of the cities is beyond what we have experienced in, say, Europe or North America for more than a century. This is very, very, very rapid growth, where the cities are growing beyond the possibility to provide infrastructure. Many of the roads are unpaved, if they even have anything of a reasonable quality road. So only the informal transit can go into those kind of places. So I think the question really is whether formal transport will emerge and whether formal transport will survive in many of the settings. I don't think we need to worry about the informal transport. They will still be there.
Barbara, do you want to add something to this?
Yes, we do have example in Taiwan. Uber first coming into our market, it has been classified as informal transport because they don't have a license to run. And our government take it as like a new services and have put them to formalize them. So right now they are under regulated, and it gives us the result. We have better services. So I think we will always have a creative way to provide accessibility, and it might not always coming into as informal services, but I think I agree with Brendan that informal services will always exist in some sort of way. And we just need to find a way to, well, regulate them or better maintain the services. That will be my response. Thank you.
If I just may add to that from Barbara, and I think it's really good that to give the example of Uber, because quite often we talk about informal, we think, oh, it's, you know, it's Africa, it's parts of the developing countries. Where we see the informal transport come in is invariably in one of two circumstances. The most typical one is that there is a failure of the formal public transport to meet the needs of the people, and gaps emerge. The other place, which may or may not be linked to the first, is that there are gaps or failures within the regulatory and organizational structures. So the cracks emerge. First of all, there's a small intrusion, clearly illegal, but if you have enough of a brass neck, you can get away with it. And then it starts to catch on and it proliferates. So informal transport is invariably responding to an unmet need and a gap within the regulatory structure. And as Barbara says, no matter where in the world you are, you're always going to find the emergence of informal arrangements.
Yeah.
John, are you happy with that answer, or would you like to make a comment?
Given that John is satisfied, can I give a shout out for Thredbo 18 that we actually have a workshop? Workshop 2 is dealing specifically with the development of the informal transport sector. And I think, are we open for papers and abstracts to be submitted? But I think this is one where we would really, really welcome more discussion on it. So it's a shout out for the workshop. Thank you.
So can I come back to links between workshop 2 and 2A and 2B, and address it first to Brendan, and then maybe after Barbara, maybe Gunnar and Andre would like to make a comment. In part of your slide demonstration, you suggested that there was a mismatch between objectives between different ownership types and the contracting authority. And I wonder whether this is a threat to the future in terms of getting efficient contracts if this mismatch isn't recognised in the construction of the contract, and particularly when there's a case of an external shock, and how contracts may then be amended, not taking into account that private and public operators have a mismatch of objectives with the contracting authority. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I don't see the problem. I mean, they're fundamentally different in nature with different goals and objectives, the authority and the operator, and then different kinds of operators. So I think this is something we've dealt with forever. And what you have, like in any circumstances, you've two parties of different nature come together to do business. And yeah, I just see it as a natural part of the operator world and the contracting world.
But does that mean we should take that into account in terms of different types of contracts for different ownership types within the same jurisdiction?
No, I'm sorry, I'm not following the question.
Well, suppose you have a jurisdiction which has a mixture of public and private operators. How do you ensure that your contracting system is fair, but recognises that there's a mismatch of objectives that comes between ownership type and goals, if you like, for public transport delivery?
Well, I thought that in the contracting environment, the goals are being set by the contracting authority. And then it's just up to the operator of whatever kind to meet what it is the contracting authority is looking for. It's a separate issue, its own internal matter. For example, the relationship it has with its workers, the relationship it has with its customers is, if it's important to the contracting authority, and Barbara summed it up already, if it's important to you, put it in the contract. And I don't know that it makes that much difference whether it's a public or private company, because you're contracting for a service to be provided. Maybe, Andre, I see you've put your camera on. Maybe you've something that you want to add. There'll be very few minutes left.
Yes.
You have 1 minute, Andre.
Yes, just 1 minute. So in principle, you can incorporate some performance measures observed in the market from the performance of privately owned operators, and incorporate this performance measure into the public company manager contract explicitly, like an incentive contract. So there is a theory behind this, but in some cases it is used. That's my short answer, since I have only 1 minute. Details are coming.
And if you look at the chat, I think Andre has really understood my question and answered it. Thank you.
I think so.
So can I direct people to the chat to see the answer to my rather badly put question? I do apologise. But it's time now to draw this to a close. Can I thank Barbara and Brendan for their presentation on 2B, and to thank all the presenters for their contribution to this webinar. Before you go, can I remind all the attendees that this is only the first of 3 Thredbo webinars. The next one is on the 19th of September. And the recordings to the recordings to the webinar will be available on the Thredbo website. My second reminder relates to the next Thredbo conference. You can see, if you haven't been to a Thredbo conference, that we have very interesting conversations and a very wide mix of attendees. So Thredbo 18 will be held in Cape Town in South Africa from Sunday the 29th of September to Thursday the 3rd of October. And the calls for abstract, as Becky has put in the chat, is now open and details are available on the Thredbo website. Apart from that, it just remains for me to thank again the speakers, not only for their presentations today, but for the roles that they played in the last Thredbo in developing, along with the rest of the workshops, what they've managed to deliver today. And secondly, to thank those behind the scenes who we haven't seen, who have managed to prepare and get this webinar working, especially at the last minute when technical issues intervene and need rapid resolution. So thank you, Becky, and thank you, Camilla. So with that, I shall end. Thank you very much for attending, and I look forward to seeing you not only at the next webinars, which are the resume from last Thredbo, but at the next Thredbo in Cape Town. Thank you very much.